The evening began like any other in the grand estate of Charles Whitmore, a man whose wealth and social standing had secured him a place among the city's elite. Yet, tonight was different. Charles, a widower known for his composed demeanor and rigid adherence to tradition, had extended an unexpected invitation to his maid, Clara James. Clara, a young black woman, had worked for him for years. Her quiet determination and unwavering professionalism had earned her a reserved place in the household, though always at a clear distance from her employer's personal affairs. The invitation was simple, yet perplexing. Charles had insisted she accompany him to dinner at the city's most prestigious restaurant. Clara hesitated, her instincts warning her of the complexities such an outing might entail. It was not customary for a maid to join her employer socially, let alone in a public setting as exclusive and scrutinizing as Le Jardin Étoilé. Dressed in her modest uniform, Clara followed Charles into the opulent dining hall. The restaurant was a showcase of grandeur, its crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow on the white linen-covered tables where the city's most influential figures dined on delicate cuisine. The moment Clara entered, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and a wave of curious, disapproving gazes swept over her. It was as if her very presence disrupted the carefully maintained harmony of the room. Charles, oblivious to, or perhaps dismissive of, the stares, approached the maitre d'. A middle-aged man, with impeccable posture, and the maitre d' greeted Charles with the polished charm reserved for only the most esteemed clientele. However, when his eyes fell on Clara, his expression faltered ever so slightly. It was a subtle hesitation, a moment of calculation, but Clara noticed it. She had seen it many times before. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," the maitre d' said, smoothly. "Your usual table, I presume?" "Yes, thank you," Charles replied, his tone brisk, yet polite. The maitre d' hesitated again, his gaze darting between Charles and Clara. His voice, though controlled, carried a faint edge of disapproval. "Forgive me, sir, but our establishment has certain expectations regarding attire." Charles stiffened, his brow furrowing. "She's with me," he said firmly, his words leaving no room for argument. Clara, sensing the tension, stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "It's quite all right, Mr. Whitmore. He's only doing his job." Her words were measured, meant to diffuse the situation, but they carried an undertone that silenced even the maitre d'. After a brief pause, he nodded stiffly and gestured toward a table near the center of the room. As they made their way through the dining area, the stares continued. Whispers flitted from table to table, like leaves caught in the wind. Clara held her head high, her expression unreadable, while Charles seemed to grow more uncomfortable with every step. When they reached their table, Clara took her seat gracefully, aware of the spectacle they had become. The meal began in strained silence. Charles attempted to make polite conversation, asking about her day and commenting on the decor, but Clara could sense his unease. The attention they attracted was not fleeting. It lingered, a persistent hum of judgment and curiosity. For Clara, this was nothing new. She had long been accustomed to being in spaces where she was silently marked as different, as other. Yet tonight was different. The disparity in their statuses was no longer confined to the walls of Charles's estate. It was on full display, laid bare for the world to see. And the world, it seemed, was not prepared to accept it. The soft clinking of cutlery and hushed murmurs of conversation filled the dining room as the waiter approached their table. His movements were precise, his demeanor practiced, but his eyes flickered with unease as they landed on Clara. He addressed Charles first, maintaining the kind of formal respect reserved for the restaurant's wealthiest patrons. "And for you, sir?" the waiter asked, leaning slightly toward Charles, as though Clara were invisible. Charles glanced at the menu briefly before responding. "The filet mignon, medium rare." The waiter nodded, then turned to Clara, his smile thinning ever so slightly. "And for the lady?" he asked, his tone noticeably different, polite but distant, as if her presence required careful navigation. Clara met his gaze calmly and ordered the roast chicken with a side of seasonal vegetables. Her voice was steady, but the subtle shift in the waiter's manner did not escape her. The waiter collected their menus and left, his movements quick, as though eager to remove himself from the situation. Across the room, another table erupted in quiet laughter. Clara didn't need to look to know the laughter wasn't innocent. She felt it, the weight of eyes on her, the whispers that hung just beneath the surface of polite conversation. It was an unspoken commentary on her presence, a silent question repeated over and over. What is she doing here? Charles, for all his outward composure, was growing visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, glancing around the room as though trying to assess the thoughts of the other diners. Clara, however, remained still. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Years of navigating spaces like this had taught her to project an aura of calm even when she felt anything but. The tension escalated when a man at a nearby table leaned toward his companions and whispered loudly enough to be overheard. "Next thing you know, they'll be letting just anyone in here." The table burst into subdued laughter. Though the comment hadn't been directed at Clara explicitly, its meaning was clear. Charles's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth, perhaps to confront the man, but Clara raised a hand slightly, stopping him. "It's fine," she said softly, though there was an edge to her voice that suggested it was anything but. The comment hung in the air like a lingering shadow, its weight pressing down on both of them. Clara turned her attention to the tablecloth, her mind racing. She had known this dinner would be unusual, but she hadn't anticipated the level of scrutiny they would face. Yet, instead of retreating into herself, Clara felt a spark ignite deep within, a quiet determination to reclaim the narrative of the evening. When the food arrived, the tension did not abate. Each bite was consumed in silence, the weight of the surrounding room bearing down on their small table. Clara could feel the stares, the whispered comments, the not-so-subtle shifts in posture from the diners who wanted to make their disapproval known without saying a word. Charles attempted to break the silence. "I hope the food is to your liking," he said, his voice forced and overly cheerful. "It's excellent," Clara replied, her tone polite but distant. She appreciated his effort, but no amount of small talk could mask the underlying discomfort that had taken hold of the evening. As they ate, Clara's thoughts turned inward. She had always known where she stood in the world, or rather, where the world had placed her. But this moment was different. Tonight, her mere presence in a space deemed not meant for her had become an act of quiet defiance. It wasn't just about the stares or the whispers. It was about the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged and who didn't. And Clara, with every bite of her meal, was breaking those rules in a way that no one in the room could ignore. The air grew heavier as the dinner progressed. Conversations around the room resumed, but the pointed glances toward their table lingered. Clara, though outwardly composed, felt every subtle gesture of discomfort aimed in her direction. The laughter from the nearby table echoed faintly in her ears, a reminder that her presence was not only noticed but silently questioned. Yet within her, something shifted. It wasn't anger, but a steady, unyielding resolve, a desire to claim her place, not through confrontation, but through undeniable dignity. Charles, sitting opposite her, was visibly unsettled. His movements were tense, his gaze darting between Clara and the rest of the room. "Clara, he began, but she interrupted him gently. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "Let them think what they will." As the main course was served, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The waiter placed her plate before her with the same mechanical precision as before, avoiding her gaze as he mumbled, "Enjoy your meal." "Thank you," Clara replied, her tone polite but steady. She could feel Charles watching her, his unease palpable, but this wasn't his battle. It wasn't his gaze that mattered tonight. It was hers. The tension came to a head when a man from the nearby table, emboldened perhaps by a second glass of wine, leaned back in his chair and spoke just loudly enough for others to hear. "What's next?" Inviting the staff to sit at the head table. Laughter rippled through the room again, sharper this time. Clara's hands froze for a moment over her fork, and the air around her seemed to still. Charles pushed back his chair slightly, his face flushed with anger, ready to respond. But Clara raised her hand, stopping him. She stood. Slowly, deliberately, she unfolded the napkin from her lap and placed it on the table. The room, already attuned to her every movement, grew quiet as she rose to her full height. She turned, not toward Charles, but toward the room itself. "I hope you're all enjoying your meals," she said, her voice clear and calm, carrying effortlessly across the space. Her words were not loud, but their weight was undeniable. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and the laughter at the nearby table faded into silence. Clara did not shout, did not accuse, did not demand. Instead, she stood with a quiet confidence that filled the room. "It's a lovely evening, isn't it?" she added, her tone light, almost conversational, as though she were speaking to old acquaintances. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had stared, whispered, and laughed. They looked away, some with embarrassment, others with defiance. But no one spoke. Satisfied, Clara turned back to Charles, who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and something else, perhaps pride. She sat down again, with the same composure with which she had risen, unfolded her napkin, and resumed her meal as though nothing had happened. The silence lingered for a moment longer before conversation slowly resumed, quieter now, the previous tension diffused but not forgotten. Clara's act, though simple, had shifted the dynamic of the room. She had said little, yet her presence and poise had spoken volumes. As they continued their meal, Clara felt the weight of the room's gaze begin to lift. It hadn't disappeared entirely, but something had changed. She hadn't demanded respect. She had simply shown them her worth. And in doing so, she had reminded them, and herself, that she did not need permission to belong. The room's energy was noticeably different now. Clara's quiet defiance had altered the dynamic, leaving a lingering unease among the diners who had whispered or laughed. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others stole furtive glances, as if trying to understand the woman who had so effortlessly taken control of a moment they thought belonged to them. Charles leaned forward, his voice low but earnest. "Clara, I'm sorry for everything tonight. I didn't anticipate—" She interrupted him gently, lifting her hand slightly. "You don't need to apologize, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was calm but firm. I've faced moments like this before. The difference tonight is that I decided not to let it go unnoticed." Her words settled between them, and Charles nodded, visibly humbled. He picked up his glass of wine and held it in his hands, turning it absently as though searching for the right thing to say. But Clara had already moved past the discomfort, focusing instead on the meal in front of her. Each bite she took, each calm movement of her hand was a statement of its own, one of grace and strength in the face of adversity. Across the room, a couple seated near the corner whispered quietly to one another, their glances darting toward Clara and Charles. Moments later, the woman rose from her seat and approached their table. Clara noticed her coming, but remained still, her expression neutral. The woman, middle-aged and elegantly dressed, hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice soft, "that you carry yourself beautifully." Her words were carefully chosen, and though they were meant as a compliment, they carried an underlying recognition of the evening's earlier tensions. "Thank you," Clara replied, her tone polite but distant. She offered a small nod, and the woman returned to her table, visibly unsure if her gesture had been appreciated. Clara didn't linger on the exchange. She had no interest in validating or dismissing the woman's intentions. Her focus remained on the present moment. As the evening progressed, the room gradually returned to its usual hum of conversation, though the stares became less frequent. Clara noticed the shift, but didn't celebrate it. It wasn't about seeking approval. It was about affirming her place, regardless of whether others accepted it. When the waiter returned with the check, his demeanor had softened. He placed the leather-bound folder on the table and hesitated, looking directly at Clara for the first time. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction," he said, his voice more genuine than it had been earlier. "It was," Clara replied simply. She met his gaze, letting the silence that followed linger just long enough to make it clear she had noticed the change in his tone. The waiter nodded and stepped away, leaving them to conclude their evening. As they prepared to leave, Charles stood first, pulling out Clara's chair with a newfound sense of respect. She rose gracefully, her back straight, her head held high. Together, they made their way toward the exit, the sound of their footsteps the only thing audible in the brief silence that fell over the room. Near the door, Charles paused, turning to Clara. "You handled tonight with more grace than I ever could have. You're remarkable." Clara gave him a small smile, one that carried both warmth and strength. "It's not about grace, Mr. Whitmore. It's about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone make you feel smaller than that." With those words, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights shimmered around them, and for the first time that night, Clara felt a sense of release. She hadn't changed the world in that dining room, but she had reminded herself, and perhaps a few others, that belonging wasn't something granted by others. It was something claimed through dignity, confidence, and an unwavering sense of self. As they walked toward the waiting car, Charles opened the door for her. Clara nodded her thanks and stepped inside, her mind already settling back into its usual calm. The evening had been challenging, but it had also been a reminder of her strength, and that, above all else, was what she chose to carry forward. As the car pulled away from the restaurant, the city's bright lights reflected in the windows, flickering like fleeting thoughts. Charles sat in silence beside Clara, his hands resting on his lap, his posture unusually reserved. For a man accustomed to control, the events of the evening had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Clara, on the other hand, gazed out of the window, her expression calm but introspective. After several moments, Charles broke the silence. "Clara," he began, his voice hesitant, "I've never seen anyone command a room the way you did tonight." Clara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't set out to command anything, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "I simply refused to shrink." Her words carried a weight that hung in the air between them, a quiet power that Charles couldn't quite put into words. He nodded, acknowledging the truth of what she said. The evening had been an unexpected lesson for him, one not just about the world they lived in, but about himself and the unspoken barriers he had never questioned. As the car rolled through the city streets, Clara reflected on the evening. She hadn't planned to make a statement. She had only wanted to enjoy the dinner she had been invited to. Yet the events of the night had unfolded in a way that made it impossible not to confront the invisible lines drawn around her. By standing tall, speaking firmly, and refusing to waver under the weight of judgment, she had transformed a moment of scrutiny into one of quiet defiance. When they arrived at Charles's estate, he stepped out first and offered her his hand. Clara hesitated for a brief moment before accepting it, her grasp firm and steady. Together, they walked up the steps to the grand front door, the night air cool against their faces. At the entrance, Charles turned to her. "Thank you for joining me tonight," he said, his tone sincere. "I invited you because I wanted to show my appreciation for everything you've done, but I realize now that I underestimated everything else." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I appreciate the invitation," she said, "but understand this, Mr. Whitmore. Appreciation is a fine gesture, but respect is something else entirely." Her words were not sharp, but they were deliberate, and they carried the same calm authority she had displayed all evening. Charles seemed to absorb them, his expression thoughtful as he nodded. "Good night, Clara," he said after a pause. His voice held a note of newfound humility. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she replied. Her tone was polite but firm, a subtle reminder that she was not merely an extension of his world, but a person who carried her own. As Clara walked to her quarters, the quiet of the night enveloped her. She felt neither triumph nor anger, only a deep sense of affirmation. The evening had been a test, not one she had chosen, but one she had faced nonetheless. And in facing it, she had reminded herself of her own worth and strength. By the time she reached her door, the events of the night had settled into her mind, not as a memory of discomfort, but as a testament to her resolve. She hadn't sought to make a statement, but in simply being herself, she had done exactly that. And as she prepared to rest, Clara felt a quiet assurance that whatever came next, she would meet it with the same unshakable sense of self that had carried her through tonight.